At first light, the road to the Berezina was already full, not crowded, full. For nearly 37 miles, German artillery teams, ammunition wagons, staff cars, half-tracks, field kitchens, wounded men, assault guns, and exhausted horses stood locked together 3 vehicles wide. Ahead was one bridge. Beyond it was the road to Minsk. Then the aircraft appeared. A bomb struck the span, steel folded into the river, and in that instant more than a bridge disappeared. The German Fourth Army lost its final organized route west. What followed was not simply an encirclement. It was the destruction of every system that allowed 165,000 armed men to function as an army. Its railway had already been cut. Its aircraft were gone. Its fuel was running out. Its retreat had been reduced to the speed of a horse cart. Its senior commanders were being killed one after another, and the city anchoring its entire withdrawal plan was about to be taken from 2 directions at once. 12 days after the Soviet offensive began, the Fourth Army no longer existed as a coherent fighting force. 6 days later, the general commanding what remained would dictate an order to surrender while sitting in Soviet captivity. But the army did not begin dying at the river. It began dying months earlier in a headquarters hundreds of miles away. A field army is not merely a mass of soldiers carrying weapons. It is a moving network. Railways bring ammunition forward. Roads carry fuel and food. Bridges preserve speed. Radios preserve command. Aircraft keep the roads open. Headquarters turn scattered divisions into one force. Remove those parts one at a time, and the men may still be standing, but the army is already coming apart. In early June 1944, the Fourth Army occupied the central sector of Army Group Center in Belarussia. It had 4 corps. The 27th Army Corps defended the approaches around Orsha. The 39th Panzer Corps held the sector toward Mogilev with several of the Army's strongest divisions. The 12th Army Corps occupied the center. The 53rd Corps remained farther back. The army had held the eastern approaches to Minsk for years. It possessed experienced staffs, established supply routes, prepared positions, and roughly 165,000 men. On paper, it was still one of Germany's major field formations, but its freedom to move had already been taken away. Adolf Hitler had designated Minsk and other towns across the Eastern Front as fortified places. They were to be held even when Soviet forces broke around them. The theory was simple. The strong points would stand like rocks in a current. The Soviet advance would divide around them. German garrisons would hold the enemy in place until a counterattack arrived. The counterattack almost never arrived. What the order actually created was a chain of anchors attached to retreating armies. Commanders at the front could see when a position had become dangerous. They could see roads filling behind them. They could see Soviet armor moving toward their flanks. But abandoning a designated position required authorization from above. And authorization often came only after the roadout had already closed. Minsk was especially dangerous as an anchor because it was not a fortress in the practical sense. It was a transportation center, rail yards, warehouses, repair shops, road junctions. It mattered because armies moved through it, not because its buildings could stop a tank army. Yet German planning treated the city as a fixed point that the Fourth Army would somehow retreat toward and defend. That assumption controlled everything behind the front. Supply routes pointed toward Minsk. Withdrawal routes pointed toward Minsk. Staff planning pointed toward Minsk. The Fourth Army's rear had been designed around reaching a city that much of the army would never see again. Then, before the Soviet artillery opened fire, the railway system began to vanish. During the night of June 19th into June 20th, Belarusian partisan groups moved against the rail network behind Army Group Center. They did not strike one train. They struck the system. Roughly 10,500 explosive charges were detonated in a coordinated operation. Rails were severed, bridges were damaged, telegraph connections failed. Junctions were hit across the region. For approximately 48 hours, the German rail network in Belorussia was thrown into paralysis at the exact moment the front required maximum movement. The timing mattered more than the explosions themselves. A railway cut during a quiet week can be repaired. A railway cut while an offensive is beginning becomes a weapon against every decision the enemy makes afterward. Supply trains stopped, reinforcements stopped, heavy equipment that should have moved by rail remained where it was. Neighboring headquarters lost the ability to build a common picture quickly. Trucks attempted to replace trains, but trucks carried less, consumed fuel, damaged the roads, and arrived late. Some reached the front only partly loaded. Within days, German formations were rationing ammunition and fuel. Then the Soviet offensive began. On June 22, 1944, 3 years to the day after Germany invaded the Soviet Union, 4 Soviet fronts attacked Army Group Center. Operation Bagration did not strike one narrow corridor. It broke open the entire German position in Belorussia. To the north and south of the Fourth Army, Soviet forces penetrated faster than German headquarters could measure. The army holding the center did not immediately collapse. That was part of the trap. Its divisions were still fighting east of Minsk while Soviet armor was already moving beyond their shoulders. The front did not retreat as one line. It tore open at the seams. By June 25th, the Fourth Army had begun withdrawing west toward the Berezina. But it was no longer withdrawing into open space. It was entering a corridor whose walls were moving inward. The destroyed railway forced almost everything onto the roads, and roads created a new problem. They could be seen from the air. German columns had to carry guns, ammunition, wounded men, horses, tanks, kitchens, fuel, headquarters records, and repair vehicles through country broken by forest, marsh, and poor tracks. Where firm roads existed, every formation wanted the same road. Where bridges existed, every formation wanted the same bridge. The retreat therefore moved at the speed of its slowest surviving vehicle. Usually, that meant a wagon. Sometimes it meant a frightened horse. Sometimes it meant nothing moved at all. Then Soviet air power arrived over the columns. The Luftwaffe was nearly absent. Fuel shortages, shattered airfields, weak local strength, and Soviet fighter superiority meant German ground troops could no longer expect reliable protection. Soviet aviation could now treat the retreating road network as a continuous target. Across Operation Bagration, 744 Ilyushin ground attack aircraft were committed. In the Berezina sector, they found columns that could not disperse into the marshes and could not leave the roads without abandoning their equipment. The effect was not only destruction, it was delay. That was more important. German formations learned that moving in daylight invited attack. At sunrise, columns stopped. Vehicles pushed beneath trees. Horse teams were led into whatever cover could be found. Men waited through the long summer day while Soviet armor continued west. After dark, the columns returned to the road. Engines restarted, wagons moved. The wounded were loaded again. Then at dawn, everything stopped. The Fourth Army's effective retreat speed had been cut roughly in half. The equation was now simple. A field army moving only at night was trying to reach a river with very few crossings. Behind it came Soviet infantry. Around it came Soviet armor. Above it came Soviet aircraft. And ahead of it, tens of thousands of vehicles were converging on the same bridge. By June 27th, the outcome was becoming visible. Not because every German formation had been defeated. Because the Soviet forces were moving faster than the German system could move information, equipment, or men. The command structure began to fracture next. General Robert Martinek, commander of the 39th Panzer Corps, was killed during the withdrawal on June 28th. His replacement, Otto Schünemann, was killed the following day. 2 corps commanders were lost on consecutive days in the same collapsing sector. Dietrich von Zauken assumed command of what remained. But by then, the corps that had begun the battle with several of the Fourth Army's strongest divisions was disintegrating between destroyed positions, blocked roads, and river crossings. Commanders could still issue orders. The problem was that the formations named in those orders were becoming impossible to find. Some had lost their radios. Some had abandoned their transport. Some had been divided by air attacks. Some had reached the river without their artillery. Others never reached it at all. At the Berezina, the army's remaining movement compressed into one physical point. The river itself was not enormous. The lack of crossings made it decisive. The principal route passed through Berezino. Behind it, the road filled for almost 37 miles. Imagine the column not as one clean line, but as a jam of incompatible movement. A tank behind a horse cart, an ambulance behind an ammunition wagon, an assault gun unable to turn, a staff car pinned between artillery teams. Men trying to move west while military police attempted to force broken vehicles off the road. Every abandoned truck narrowed the passage. Every frightened horse stopped the vehicles behind it. Every air raid turned delay into wreckage. When Soviet aircraft struck the crossing, the bridge ceased to be a route and became a choke point under attack. Emergency ferries were assembled. Rafts were pushed into the water. Engineers improvised crossings from whatever material remained. Men could be ferried. Some light vehicles could be floated. Heavy artillery could not. Assault guns could not. Many tanks could not. Transport columns waited on the eastern bank while the Soviet pursuit closed from behind. The Fourth Army began abandoning the machinery that made it dangerous. Guns were disabled or left intact. Vehicles ran out of fuel and were pushed aside. Horse-drawn equipment was cut loose. Staff records disappeared into fires, ditches, or the river. The precise inventory was never completed because many of the quartermasters responsible for counting those losses were themselves captured days later. But the military result is clear. The army lost essentially all of its organic heavy equipment during the withdrawal and encirclement. A man with a rifle could still cross on a raft. A field army could not. That distinction decided what emerged from the river line. On the far side, Soviet armored forces were already fighting for the approaches to Minsk. German engineers demolished bridges at Borisov in an effort to delay the 5th Guards Tank Army and the 11th Guards Army. The demolitions bought time. They did not restore the front. The 5th Panzer Division was thrown into the approaches as one of the last mobile German formations capable of interfering with the Soviet advance. It fought hard enough to delay the crossing and movement toward Minsk, but it lost most of its remaining armored strength in the process. Once that force had been spent, there was no German armored reserve in the sector capable of mounting a serious counterstroke. The encirclement was no longer a contest between two mobile forces. It had become a closing timetable. Minsk fell on July 3rd. The 2nd Guards Tank Corps entered from the northeast and east. The 1st Guards Tank Corps approached from the southeast. Soviet armored formations reached the city from opposing directions and linked inside the Belarusian capital. German plans had treated Minsk as the point toward which the 4th Army would withdraw. Now Soviet tanks occupied it while most of the 4th Army was still east of the city. The anchor had changed hands. The retreat was moving toward an enemy-held destination. By July 4th, Soviet forces had closed the remaining routes beyond Minsk. The ring was continuous. Inside were approximately 100,000 to 105,000 German troops. That number requires care. The pocket did not contain the 4th Army alone. It also held remnants of the 9th Army driven north from the fighting around Bobruisk. But the 4th Army formed the largest part of the trapped force. Its commander, Kurt von Tippelskirch, was not inside. He had escaped before the encirclement became final. He survived. His army did not. The result was a pocket containing divisions, corps staffs, wounded men, fragments of other formations, and thousands of stragglers, but no commander who had been formally appointed to direct all of them. General Vincenz Müller, commander of the 12th Army Corps, assumed responsibility for the trapped force. His corps remained one of the largest recognizable organizations inside the pocket. That made Müller the closest thing the 4th Army still possessed to an army commander. What he inherited was not a defensible fortress. It was a shrinking landscape. There was no supply route. There was no air cover. There was no relief force forming outside. The heavy equipment had been abandoned at the river. The roads west were cut. The radios were failing. And the terrain itself favored the forces hunting them. The country east of Minsk was broken by forest, swamp, and narrow tracks. For years, large areas had been active partisan territory. German units trying to escape through the woods faced 3 separate barriers. Soviet armor controlled the open ground. Soviet aircraft attacked movement in daylight. Partisan detachments watched tracks, bridges, and forest routes that regular armored units could not easily cover. A breakout group might evade one of those forces. To reach German lines, it had to evade all 3. Inside the pocket, formations stopped behaving like divisions. They broke into columns. Columns broke into groups. Group broke into men following whoever still appeared to know the direction west. Fuel was poured from one vehicle into another. Wounded men were left with medical personnel when transport failed. Maps were outdated before officers finished reading them. Orders described roads that were already blocked. The Soviet reduction of the pocket worked from the outside inward. Corps commanders and divisional commanders were captured as the remaining organized groups were cut apart. Paul Volkers of the 27th Army Corps was taken. Friedrich Gallwitzer of the 53rd Corps was taken. Divisional commanders disappeared into Soviet captivity with the remnants of their headquarters. This was not merely a high number of senior prisoners. It was the removal of every level through which coordinated resistance might have continued. By July 8th, Müller attempted to break out with elements including the 18th Panzer Grenadier Division. He was captured. What happened next gave the final days of the Minsk pocket a character unlike many other encirclements on the Eastern Front. Müller ordered the troops still inside to surrender. He dictated the text to another German prisoner. It was typed on a German typewriter. The order was genuine. It was not a Soviet forgery placed beneath a captured officer's name. Müller later acknowledged that he had dictated it and regarded it as his decision. The Soviets then turned that authentic decision into a battlefield weapon. They printed the order as leaflets. Aircraft dropped it over the forest. Loudspeakers broadcast it toward German positions. The message came from a general whose authority many of the trapped soldiers still recognized. That made it more powerful than propaganda invented by the enemy. It told the remaining units what many of their officers could already see. No military objective remained. No relief was coming. No route west was open. Further resistance could kill more men, but it could not change the outcome. The first order did not reach everyone. Communications had collapsed. Some groups never saw the leaflets. Some did not believe them. Some continued moving through the forest in the hope of finding a gap. Muller issued another order. Organized resistance largely collapsed on July 8th. Scattered groups held out through the 9th, 10th, and 11th. On July 11th, Soviet forces declared the pocket liquidated. The offensive had opened on June 22nd. Soviet armored forces entered Minsk 12 days later. The trapped formations were eliminated within another week. The Fourth Army had gone from approximately 165,000 men to destruction as an effective force in less time than many armies required to prepare a major operation. The casualty figures are often confused because several different totals describe different parts of the disaster. Approximately 40,000 German troops were killed inside the Minsk pocket. Between 60,000 and 70 were captured over the fighting and subsequent clearing operations. A lower Soviet count of roughly 35,000 prisoners referred more narrowly to the organized mass surrenders at the end, rather than every prisoner collected during the full collapse. The Fourth Army's own total loss was larger, approximately 130,000 men from an initial strength of about 165,000. But that 130,000 covers the Army's losses across the wider operation from June 22nd onward. It is not a casualty number for the Minsk pocket alone. The German accounting listed 5,015 dead, 16,870 wounded, and 108,485 missing. The missing category is the most revealing. It did not mean every man's fate was unknowable forever. It meant the German command system had lost the ability to account for its own soldiers. The clerks, headquarters officers, company commanders, and quartermasters who should have produced the reports were dead, scattered, or in captivity beside the men they were supposed to count. The paperwork collapsed because the organization behind the paperwork no longer existed. 6 days after the pocket was declared destroyed, the Soviet government staged proof of the victory in Moscow. On July 17th, 57,600 German prisoners were marched through the city. 19 generals walked at the head of the column. Vincenz Müller was among them. So were other senior commanders captured during the Belarusian offensive. The prisoners had been selected from the larger population taken by the Soviet fronts, including men captured at Vitebsk, Mogilev, Bobruisk, and east of Minsk. They were also selected for their ability to complete the march. It was not an accidental gathering of prisoners. It was a constructed demonstration. For years, foreign audiences had heard Soviet claims of enormous German losses and often treated them with skepticism. A communique could be dismissed. 57,000 prisoners walking through a capital in daylight could not. Cameras recorded the generals. Crowds watched the columns pass. Street cleaning vehicles followed the final ranks in a deliberate gesture of humiliation. The march was theater, but the defeat it displayed was real. The Fourth Army was later rebuilt in name. New headquarters could be formed, new units could be assigned, an old designation could be placed on a new organization. But the army that had held the eastern approaches to Minsk was gone. Its divisions had been destroyed or absorbed elsewhere. Its commanders were dead or prisoners. Its vehicles stood abandoned beside roads and riverbanks. Its rifles had passed into Soviet hands with the men carrying them. Its records had disappeared with its staffs. And its final acting commander had watched Soviet aircraft scatter his own surrender order over the forest. It is tempting to explain the destruction with one enormous Soviet attack. That misses the mechanism. The Fourth Army was not destroyed at one point. It was dismantled in sequence. First, political orders removed its freedom to retreat. Then partisans removed its railway. Soviet aviation removed daylight movement. The roads removed speed. The Berezina removed its heavy equipment. The deaths of senior officers removed continuity of command. The fall of Minsk removed the destination of the retreat. The closing ring removed the remaining routes west. And Müller's order removed the reason to continue a battle that could no longer achieve anything. An army can survive heavy casualties. It can survive the loss of a town. It can even survive a temporary encirclement if movement, command, supply, and relief still exist. The Fourth Army lost all four. By the time Soviet tanks closed the pocket east of Minsk, they were not trapping the same army that had stood there on June 22nd. They were surrounding men whose railway, fuel, aircraft, bridges, artillery, headquarters, and escape routes had already been taken away. The bridge at Berezina did not destroy the Fourth Army by itself. It revealed that almost nothing holding the army together was left to cross it.